We put that letter into Wall Street Journal. It was signed by 1,000 Asian American leaders, including the founders of Zoom and DoorDash on YouTube. And so that was really a historic and special moment where so many Asian Americans across all backgrounds came together to call out the violence.
Welcome to The Tiger in the Room. My name is Hannah, and I'll be your host. We are a podcast series that is here to talk about the current and ongoing national crisis of anti-Asian hate crimes. A lot of us first heard about anti-Asian hate in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. We believe that hate against Asians and Asian Americans is not just seen in acts of violence. It is also seen when our community is silenced, invisibilized, and erased. We plan to talk about the challenges that modern-day Asian Americans face every day, whether it's in the workplace, in public, in media, and so on. We also talk to the organizers, activists, and change makers who are fighting for our community and fighting for change. We hope you'll join us. Our guest today is Justin Zhu. Justin Zhu is a Bay Area native who is also the co-founder and executive director of a nonprofit organization called Stand with Asian Americans. Stand with Asian Americans seeks to unite Asian and Asian American business leaders to speak out against Asian hate and provide support to AAPI employee resource groups that are seeking to help Asian employees who experience discrimination in the workplace. We talked to Justin about his personal experience dealing with anti-Asian discrimination as a tech CEO and founder, and how this has led him to become an activist for Asians in the workplace, as well as rising anti-Asian hate crimes happening in the Bay Area. This interview with Justin Zhu was recorded on September 23rd, 2022. What was your motivation for founding SWAA, the acronym for Stand with Asian Americans? What led you to create this organization and just what that experience was like for you?
We came out of the Atlanta SWAA shootings in response to the historic, horrific attack on Asian Americans. And during that time, I was the CEO and co-founder of a startup that I created. We responded to the attack by immediately changing our LinkedIn, our Twitter, our social. We sent a letter internally. I hosted a town hall with the company to talk about anti-Asian violence. And as sort of the days were progressing after the Atlanta shootings, myself and a couple of friends, we were particularly disappointed by the lack of just corporate and mainstream response to the attack in Atlanta. And so we thought at least the Asian Americans need to be speaking up, especially ones who have positions of power and influence. And so my co-founders, Dave Liu and Wendy Nguyen, we came together and crafted a letter that called out the anti-Asian violence, that called for supporting AAPI nonprofits, called for supporting Asians in the workplace through ERGs, and ensuring fair representation of all marginalized groups. And we put that letter into Wall Street Journal. It was signed by 1,000 Asian American leaders, including the founders of Zoom and DoorDash on YouTube, many other great companies that impacted really all our lives. And so that was really a historic and special moment where so many Asian Americans across all backgrounds came together to call out the violence. And what started as a letter has now become 2 chapters. We have a chapter in New York City, and we have a chapter in San Francisco. And what really we're focused on is getting the Asian American professionals who have the resources, who have their various talents to really put that into solving Asian American hate crimes and discrimination against Asian Americans in the workplace.
Discrimination against Asian Americans in the workplace, it definitely seems to be one of those elephant in the room topics where I think a lot of us know it does happen, but it tends to be not discussed or acknowledged as much as discrimination against other minority groups. For me, seeing what you guys are doing with SWAA and seeing that ad in the Wall Street Journal, that was pretty groundbreaking, actually, to see the various leaders in the finance or media industry really speak out about this. Did you ever face experiences of being discriminated against? Did you ever feel like the standard was a little bit different for you because you were Asian? in the workplace, even though you were a CEO of a, multi-million dollar evaluated startup?
So when I founded my company, I was in my early 20s. Most of the earliest investors that we were able to get, we talked to a lot of investors, were Asian American. So most of the non-Asian American, mostly white investors wrote me and my co-founder off. And now, we're a multi-billion-dollar company. So that would have, of course, been an amazing investment. But it was mostly the Asian Americans who kind of heard what I had to say and gave me a chance to try this out. And over the years of building my company, I continue to face discrimination, just sort of lack of sort of equal opportunity is another way to put it. Even though we had really good product and traction and customers, I think relatively speaking, it was more difficult for someone like myself to raise funds that, let's say, a white person or a white man would get the benefit and get much easier time. And so that kind of cultivated into really more the discrimination I faced just from my own investors. It led to a story which I was been working on for some time, about 10 months, with a journalist at Bloomberg to talk about my story and talk about how I overcame discrimination to then build a multi-billion-dollar company, which last year our company raised $200 million Series E round at a $2 billion valuation. And so at that point is why I felt the time is right for me to speak about my story. But as I decided to speak up about my story, my investors were pretty against it because it also talked about some of the discrimination I had faced. Long story short, from that, in the week that my story was supposed to come out, I was terminated by my investors, under this pretext of treating my mental health. So kind of backtracking a little bit, Stay with Asian Americans was founded about a month before I was terminated from my company as CEO. Since the termination, I was also removed from the board. And so I've completely severed kind of official ties. I still have shares, but I've been now focused 100% on grassroots activism, both on the anti-Asian violence side and also the discrimination in the workplace for Asian Americans. And so for me, coming to America, I was born in Shanghai, China, and my parents and I left everything in China to come here for this American dream, this American equality, opportunity, this justice that, is talked about. But then as I went through it and performing, at really kind of just the highest levels and playing into the American dream, I realized that it can actually turn pretty dark in terms of the dream and especially for people of color, and realized that, why I, decided to do a company in the first place was not because I wanted to be this tech unicorn CEO. It was really what I felt I can do in my capacity to help the world. I felt that Asian Americans were underrepresented and underserved, especially in the leadership roles and CEO roles. And I felt that I could do my part to show that, hey, Asians, you could be the leader, you could be the CEO, the person at the top. You don't have to just top out at a certain, ceiling or top out in technology or in finance, right? A certain role, right? You could be that overall leader. There was a research that just came out with Ascend that looked at 1,000 companies and found very few and very little change in board representation for Asian Americans. And most of the board members that you're seeing are founders of companies. They were the founders, CEOs versus some, sort of external or executives. So as we kind of hit the ceiling and I hit the ceiling, you do see a very kind of strong reaction towards having us be in those positions. And also when we do fight back, strong forces try to silence you and try to make it very difficult for you to fight back.
That's actually very true. I mean, there was an article in 2012 in The Atlantic that actually published results from a study. So basically they gave employees the resumes of two different employees. One had an Asian last name, the other had more of a European last name. And based on how they described both people, they found that those employees reacted more negatively to the Asian employee who had a more dominant personality trait versus the other one. So it suggested to them that there's a sense people don't like it when Asians don't stay in their place, where we kind of buck the stereotype of coming off as this competent, submissive worker, which it seems like that's exactly kind of what you experienced firsthand. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. We can be assertive in our own ways, right? Being assertive, it doesn't have to be just you're talking loud or aggressive. It could be consistency, persistence, right? I think Asian Americans, we share a lot of those traits. And so it just gets into challenging power, right? You see it just for other minorities, whether it's for women or LGBTQ, people in power. don't like to be challenged, especially called out for their discrimination, right? And they're going to do everything they can to say, well, that wasn't discrimination, right? Or you're just, kind of overly sensitive, it's lacking the leadership material, or it's not a hate crime, right? People in power telling us, and we're seeing it time and time again, we're getting beat up, we're getting targeted, or we're getting kind of our heads chopped off as we stick it up, above the ceiling. And it's generational, right? You hear from folks' parents, hey, they topped out at IBM, at HP or whatever company, right? Or they left their company to do their own company, right? And Dave, one of my co-founders of SWAA, he actually started a fund called Hyphen Capital to invest in Asian American founders. And what he saw was, and he was a founder himself, and there's just a lack of funds and investors who really try to understand Asian Americans. Hyphen capital is because a lot of our names kind of have two words and has a hyphen in them. It gets into politics. You're going to have to be ready for a backlash. And it's not about what's fair or what is right, because there's a sense of, I think, especially in America, where we have the biggest military budget in history. Might is right a lot of times, right? Whoever's stronger, you get to write the story, you get to write the history. And so I think as we fight back, we have to tell our story. We have to support people who are telling their stories, to say, hey, I support you. I see that as a hate crime. I see that as discrimination. I've been there. You're not alone. And so I think, podcasts like yours and really kind of the Stop Asian Hate, and now we're calling it the Fight Asian Hate movement is really about how do we support each other.
You mentioned, we can be assertive in our own way. Culturally, I think it's not natural for us to just be very vocal about things that we feel, are oppressing us. In this country, I think there's a sense if you don't speak up for yourself, no one's going to acknowledge it. People will kind of just take advantage of that. And I think you see that pattern very clearly, like in the workplace. It's always about, self-promotion, putting yourself out there. But, from my experience in corporate America, I do feel that it's hard for us to kind of do that as Asian Americans. And the ones who do, there's a sense like they have to kind of give up something in order to be able to really adopt those kind of personality traits. I think there's still, for some of us, a real struggle and hesitation to be able to find that in us to be vocal and speak out. Because, there's a fear of doing that, a fear of losing your job, getting fired, backlash. Do you feel like we kind of do it to ourselves?
I think this fear probably is shared by a lot of recent immigrants, not just Asian immigrants. We were lucky to win the lottery, to get the visa to come here. And we're just trying to establish ourselves here, right? And so there is real fear, of, losing your visa or not having the resources to feed your family and, have a home. And so I think as a consequence, we don't speak up as much. And that's what our parents tell us, because for them, it is really survival, so especially if they're first generation, right? Because they're trying to keep their job that they're lucky, they're fortunate to get, or they're on a visa. The second generation or 1.5 generations, have an opportunity to fight back because this is our country. We identify with this country, right? We're born here, grew up here. I do think that the younger generations are speaking up more, though. I think in the corporate sense, what the existing kind of corporate leadership training in general, DEI training in general for, let's say, for women or people of color, is to try to sort of have you be more like a white man, because that's kind of the archetype, right? But of course, there are many different forms of leadership, right? And there's many ways to communicate and solve problems. So I do think what we can push for more is that, hey, the values that we have in terms of looking out for more agreement, looking for consensus, right? Being more humble. I think those are really great values. At the same time, that cannot be our only approach, because if we are discriminated, something does happen, we do have to speak up. And that gets into kind of just in legal context, if something bad happens to you and there's an injustice, like you may have to file a lawsuit, right? You may have to go and file a police report, right? Because otherwise you're for sure going to not get accountability, probably in the way that you want, unless you are taking some action. So I think we do need to shift towards speaking up. I think there are, you can say, generational teaching or generational trauma that prevents us from speaking up. Part of changing that is you're seeing this rise in Asian employee resource groups, Asian ERGs. And so one of our partners, Asian Leaders Alliance, they're a coalition of several hundred ERGs. And before the Atlanta shootings, they had about 100 ERGs in the coalition. And about a year later, it skyrocketed to over 600. And some of them are at big companies that, been around for decades with a lot of Asian American employees who were able to get an ERG for the first time, not because they didn't need it, but because they didn't feel like they could have one. Or they were actually, we've heard folks who were saying, "No, you don't need your own ERG. Why don't you join that?
Yeah.
Already have other ERGs." And so I think that community needs to be there so that when we do speak up, because you're going to face like negative action, most likely, especially challenging power, like there's a community that can support you. So I think that has to go hand in hand. Otherwise, it's only the ones who maybe have a lot of resources or have nothing to lose in some ways, right, that could speak up. For others who are, say, like who've been here for a long time, that they have that network, they have the resources, right? They have kind of maybe some of the generational stuff that we currently lack.
I know that SWAA is also launching, this national registry that documents cases of workplace discrimination against AAPIs. And, this is the first of its kind that I know of. I just wanted to know, like, what are your goals with this registry? And, what's been the feedback to date since you guys launched it?
So Salmon Asian Americas, we are launching a workplace discrimination or workplace justice platform. The way it came about is as we launched the letter for anti-Asian hate crimes and violence, we started getting emails from folks who face discrimination in the workplace. And oftentimes they ran out of options. They've talked to many existing groups and even lawyers, and they're not getting help to fight an anti-Asian discrimination in the workplace. And so we kind of saw this is a problem. And, we felt it intuitively. We know I've definitely faced it. But as over the year and a half that we've been around, we received a lot of reports with pretty severe consequences for the individual, folks going through depression and health issues. So really the psychological violence that they're facing, right, where it's not kind of being recognized. It was hard enough to recognize even physical violence that this was happening, right, to Asians, let alone more kind of invisible psychological violence. Because of that, we've been developing this platform to first report discrimination and then get resources, speak to human beings who've been through experiences in terms of discrimination and get connected to Asian American employment lawyers or employment lawyers to really understand this issue, get connected to resources for telling your story, whether it's more anonymous or whether it's in the press, get connected to a community who really kind of, understands these issues and have empathy for what you're going through. And so that's been missing. And personally, as I was going through it, I didn't find anything like that. And hearing from many others, like that's been the case. And so our Asian American community, we're doing a lot on sort of using soft power, things like cultural things and education, media, and that's needed and that's great. But we also need hard power, lawsuits or having a protest, right, or strike, right, and really leveraging kind of our community to actually demand change versus sort of advocate for it. Right? We need to demand things that we feel is fair. We need to demand things that we think is unjust that needs to be changed. And hopefully in the future, as our community becomes more aware of discrimination, what that looks like and what to do or not to do. I mean, one kind of immediate advice we give is HR fundamentally works for the company. They're not there for your best interest fundamentally. So be careful what you say to them, right? We hope that through more training, education, that we can fight this discrimination better. And then really have precedents of Asian Americans winning like discrimination cases, in the public. Because if you search for Asian American discrimination, you really find very few stories historically on us fighting, let alone winning.
I never thought about it that way as, using soft power and hard power. I think you're absolutely right. I think we're very good at the soft power part, even without us trying. I mean, let's be honest, like people love Asian things, right? So I don't think we have problems there, but you're right. In the hard power, we haven't seen as many members of our community really stepping up in that aspect. That brings me to, Michelle Lee. She's the attorney who just launched a federal lawsuit against her former employer for a racial and gender-based discrimination. In terms of what's going on with her right now and the coverage that she's been getting, why is a case like hers, so important right now?
Michelle Lee, she was general counsel at a $38 billion private equity fund based out of Connecticut. And through her time at the company, she had faced both race, gender, and other forms of discrimination. And this year recently filed a federal lawsuit And her story is pretty special and groundbreaking in many ways because her case is the highest profile anti-Asian workplace discrimination case that's been out there. We do have all the stories in the past of Asian women or Asians filing discrimination, but it's more centered around gender versus for her, it's both gender and race, right? Because they're intricately intertwined. And not only has she filed this federal lawsuit, she's also speaking publicly about it. And so there's a story in USA Today that talks about her case. And then she's continually updating the community, the public, as she's going through the laws, how she's feeling, what is it like to go through it. She is opening up, her really traumatic experience to do so. And so, really haven't seen anything like it. This is a tide turning for us to speak up and for employers to know that we're not going to just stay silent when you discriminate against, that we are going to fight back and we're going to support people who are fighting back. And so Michelle has gotten a lot of great responses and she posts on LinkedIn and people really supporting her publicly and that needs to continue. So this is really, I think, hopefully a turning point for discrimination against Asians in the workplace. But I think really of her story and I think who she's appealing to, and you hear her story, is she's fighting back because she feels it's her duty to, because she has 3 young boys. She feels if someone in her position who has an amazing background, amazing person, and this is happening to her, and she has the resources to fight back, and she doesn't. She feels like it's her really responsibility, and so I think her addressing this lawsuit is to the Asian American community, and that's resonating. I think that's really most important. And as you become more powerful, as these cases continue, other cases rise up, we're going to get detractors for sure to say, hey, this is not discrimination, or this is not a hate crime. This is a waste of your money, waste of your time, right? Your lawyers might even tell you that because, hey, why don't you just settle and move on, right? But then really because so few of these cases are fought, when you do have opportunity, it's really you have much bigger cultural impact. And that's why I think things are called a hate crime, right? In a sense, workplace discrimination is a workplace hate crime. It really affects all of us who are in the workplace. So when you do fight back, not only are you fighting back for yourself and your family, but really all the Asian Americans and marginalized groups who've been discriminated, and with the aggressors having no accountability, right? Which further just emboldens their actions.
All of that definitely resonates. It's absolutely right. Like a hate crime doesn't just have to be, someone calling you a chink or, shoving you. It can just also be that. I've always personally felt that one of the biggest form of hatred that we see against Asian Americans in this country is actually not through violence, but in the repression of our potential in this country. You see this, especially, in the workplace and in elite college admissions. There's just like that cap put on our success, preventing us from really being able to do what we want to do or be what we want to be, because we have to fit this perception, like there can't be too many of us, or we can't be this, we have to be this. There's also this very common argument that you see in corporate America, and then also just in other elite institutions like the Ivy League, where, they say that there's too many of us here, and that's exactly why we're successful, and there's no way we can be discriminated against. And, I remember like when I started working on Wall Street and I would see these D&I initiatives talking about recruiting more employees of color. And they would use that term very openly, employees of color. But then if you look in the parentheses, it's Black, Brown, Latino, Native American, and that's it. It's very blatant that they leave out Asians. I've also heard it in tech too, that, Asians don't count as a minority in tech. What they call diversity is more around like women or sexual orientation or other minority groups. I was just curious what your thoughts are about that logic, this idea that, there's too many of us, so therefore we can't be discriminated against.
When the Asian Americans were building the railroads, there were a lot of Asian Americans in the railroad companies, but it doesn't mean they don't face discrimination, right? Just because we're at the factory floor, producing your goods and doing the hard work doesn't mean we're not facing discrimination. And I think in addition to that, because the minority side is that, oh, you're doing so well, you're in these professional roles. Well, just because you have a decent salary, just because you have some money in the bank, does not mean you don't face racism, or you don't face sexism, or you don't face anti-religious persecution, right? Those are not mutually exclusive things. The dominant view is that, oh, Asian Americans are all doing well, which first is not true. And second, because they're doing well, who cares about discrimination, right? There's a fight going on right now in schools with Harvard, right? And the kind of affirmative action. The same fight happened to the Jewish community, right? They had quotas that prevented them from coming into the schools. And just because the Jewish community might be doing better financially does not mean they don't face, persecution for their beliefs. And so I think for the Asian American community, a lot of it is not only our skin color or our race, but also the beliefs that we hold, right? That, look at the world a certain way, in a more communal way. And so we are also being persecuted for our beliefs. So I think fundamentally, the argument that we don't face discrimination, you can easily sort of fight that. We happen to be great employees, which is good. We make up a lot of these companies, and a lot of post 1965, the way the immigration worked is we were selected for the skill sets that America wanted, right? In terms of like engineering, in terms of technology. And so as a consequence, there's more of us in those fields. But as a percentage of all of Asia, Asia is over half the world. We're a small percentage of the Googles, the top places, right? So if you look at a bigger picture, for the ones who actually got a visa to come to America, they won a lottery literally to be here, right? And they're oftentimes sending money back home to their home countries. So I think that view is also not accurate, that we're all doing well. Like, hey, you might be doing well if you were an individual, but you have a whole family, not only here, but also back in perhaps in your home countries that you're supporting. I think those are the myths that really need to get changed, because, it really downplays what we face. It dehumanizes us to make us feel like our issues don't matter, or we have to work multiple times as hard as a white person to get the same results, the same reward. If we accept that, ultimately what we're seeing is our life is worth less than someone else's life, and saying that we're less than human in this country. When you kind of put it in that way, I think it's very hard to accept. We need to get what's fair.
I saw Michelle Lee write about this idea of an Asian standard and how that needs to, go away. And that Asian standard referring to that idea that there's a separate standard put aside for us. That's, I would argue it's a higher standard that we're expected to reach. We're judged based on our performance, but not our potential. We have to really deliver over and over again to show what we're worth. And that standard doesn't seem to be applied to other groups as well. And I think that in and of itself also creates an unfair, advantage. We have to prove ourselves over and over again. We're literally, not valued otherwise unless we produce. And I do feel just from speaking with friends and colleagues and people that I know, there's a sense of feeling very comfortable, I think, in where we are right now, having these high paying jobs, being very well educated, living in cities like New York or SF and being able to just kind of live the life. We almost feel like it's optional to kind of think that, something like this is worth my time worrying about or getting involved or organizing. I was just curious if that's also your opinion. What's your view on how that should change? Does it need to change? How we can sort of get out of that way of thinking that, everything is comfortable. And so we don't really feel the need to speak up for, the more disadvantaged in our community.
That definitely happens. Just in general, people who are more comfortable, whether you're Asian, white, black, it's easy to kind of just forget about the more underprivileged, or to think about helping others. We have an opportunity, especially with the workplace, to connect more with their heritage, right? To kind of understand, hey, perhaps your parents' generation were the ones who, might have been in the SROs in Chinatowns or, in Koreatowns, running the small business. That don't forget where we came from. We were very fortunate to be in that position. When we talk about the Asian American community, it's really a very new concept, because we're kind of in our own kind of ethnic communities. Because the Asian American identity is a very broad identity, because it encompasses over half the world, right? And so it's almost like a world identity. It's almost like saying we're being human. But I think there are things that Asian countries and Asian immigrants share. For a lot of our countries, we cultivate and eat rice, right? And this kind of this culture and work that it takes to eat rice, does really kind of bring into more of this communal aspect. Another kind of shared cultural thing is tea. A lot of us drink tea. So I do think there's an opportunity to build that stronger connection to the community, because otherwise, your community most likely, unless you're in the enclaves of San Francisco, like LA, maybe New York, you're going to be a minority of the group, right? So you're kind of fitting into a more largely white community. It's harder to kind of just do more the Asian stuff. You also don't want to be ostracized by the white community. right? So that if you're speaking about anti-Asian violence all the time when you're hanging out or playing golf, like people may be like, yeah, I don't really care about that. Maybe we don't want to invite this guy next time or this girl next time for our hangouts. But then if you're hanging out with Asians, I think if you ask about it, they probably care about it. San Francisco, where it's last year we were 37% Asian, 38% white, and this year perhaps we're getting into predominantly Asian. There was a recent survey about what do citizens care about. They were able to break it out by race. The number one thing that Asians cared about was their safety, which is really concerning. This is San Francisco, right, where you have the oldest documented histories, Chinatowns, Japantown, Manila Town. You have such a big population too. And we're number one thing we're about is the basic safety, and that's a problem, right? We do have an opportunity now to kind of really come together. Just hiding even in your own neighborhoods is not going to work because people have worked really hard and pay a lot of money to be in the Bay Area, and they're still getting beat up. And this is not going to get better as sort of this China and the US kind of fight for dominance happens. The rhetoric is very anti-China, and it just comes back even under Biden, right? Of course, Trump was super clearly anti-China, racist. But even under Biden, he says, let's not forget, our enemy is China, right? We have to focus on competition with them and their espionage, things like that. And that comes back and hurts Asian Americans, right? We need to have this impetus to kind of force us there. And I think that's happening, whether we like it or not. We're going to have to get off our butts and do something.
I think especially in the last 2 years, I think what we've seen is a lot of Asian Americans experiencing kind of that awakening, like collectively, just from seeing like the dialogue that was happening around what happened after Atlanta. There was just a real sense of people being like, finally being proud of who they were and kind of owning up to it. You touched on something that I did want to ask you about, which is, I know you're involved right now with a lot of grassroots organizing and awareness efforts around the anti-Asian violence in the Bay Area. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that? What's the situation been like, and what have you been doing to get involved with that?
The anti-Asian violence has been going on for, in the current spike for years, but really it's been going on since Asians have gotten here. More recently in the Bay Area, there has been a spike in violence against Asian elders. So in a span of a couple of weeks, several Asian elders have been brutally attacked in the daytime. One Asian woman in her 60s was shot in her back and killed on Sunday. When these attacks really started peaking in 2020, you had groups, Compassion in Oakland and Chinatown Volunteer Coalition, that started volunteer patrol groups in the Chinatowns, right, in these areas. It's 2 years later, they're still patrolling volunteer groups.
Oh my gosh.
And it's give you a sense of an acceptable sort of level of just conditions for an Asian American. And going back to the survey for San Francisco, the number one thing that Asians were concerned about was their safety. And you're seeing this sort of, I would say, rising of the Asian community to defend our community and defend our interests. Most recently, the recall of our DA, San Francisco, Chester Boudin, who just had this record of not prosecuting crimes, not prosecuting anti-Asian hate crimes, and even gaslighting our communities to say, hey, what's the point of doing this? And really discounting what our community was raising. We have a new DA that's clear that she's going to be prosecuting more hate crimes, and she's going to review past potential anti-Asian hate crimes. We're now looking at the police, both Oakland and San Francisco. There's not enough police response. In San Francisco, we hosted a town hall with the police chief, demanded him to meet us and answer questions. As part of that, we had brought in translators so they can translate in Cantonese and Mandarin in these Asian languages. And we had one Cantonese speaker share that 4 months ago, she was attacked on the bus in San Francisco. She still sees the attacker in her neighborhood. She's filed a police report. There has been no updates.
Wow.
Right? She had to come to this town hall that we, really kind of put together. We only got because of this unfortunate attack on these Asian elders, and did this emergency march to demand it. But if it weren't for that, who knows when she'll even get her voices heard. This is in a city that's 37% plus Asian. We have to be in positions of power. We have to have that influence so that we can have our issues heard, because we've been yelling stop Asian hate for years. And the politicians have been saying, hey, we're going to do everything we can to stop Asian hate. But there has been no results. And really what we're seeing is enough of the rhetoric, we want results. And so now we need to start demanding results. And this is really where, when we did the emergency march because of the Asian elder violence, we went with fight Asian hate instead of stop Asian hate, because we have to go fight for our civil rights. We've heard from Asian elders who, because they felt no one really is addressing the issues and safety and cared about them, they're thinking of buying a gun so they could defend themselves and not die just as a victim. That's what we're up to. And that's the state of things. And it's unacceptable. It gets back into, if we're being discriminated in the workplace, in these professional spaces, right? Whether it's in the city government or federal government or big, powerful corporations, that's going to trickle down. That's going to affect people on the ground who aren't getting the resources and getting the attention and getting the changes that they need, because we'll not be in the room. We're not going to have the power to go advocate for the change that we need and continue to do the change until the problem is solved. So it's not just, let's pass a bill and then have some funding. This needs a long-term solution, because this has been happening for a long time. There are deep systemic issues that leads to discrimination and violence in the streets and in the workplace. And so we need to be in these positions and keep us there until this is solved.
I follow a couple Instagram pages that do cover what's happening in SF on a daily basis. They cover like the violence that's happening. They document it. There's video, there's photos. Like, you don't have more visual proof that there is like a pattern of anti-Asian violence happening. And it blows my mind how there is just a complete lack of outcry about this. I don't hear Asian celebrities talking about it. I don't hear Asian reporters featuring it, except the SF media outlets, which rightfully so, because they're the local, news outlets down there. But it just amazes me, like, how you can have so much proof, like, right there in front of you, and no one is taking this seriously.
We are great scapegoats, right? And great groups to silence. If you're a leader, whether it's of a city or of a country or of a government, like, you don't want more problems that you have to deal with. So what happens is a lot of leaders say, oh, we don't have an anti-Asian hate crime problem, or we don't have a workplace discrimination problem or sexism problem. Instead of trying to solve it, they will try to silence people. It took until 2020, because of all the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes, for San Francisco police to have a hotline that you can report crimes in Chinese languages, whereas we have a city that's almost a quarter Chinese American. They basically have to report the crime on a website, going through a bunch of forms and in English, and it basically makes it very difficult, almost making it feel, hey, they don't want you to report this, right? And there's that, like, the barrier to reporting and getting, justice is there. I think in San Francisco, you're hearing more because, there's just a lot more of us, and we live it every day. I think New York, you're seeing as well, right? New York is, it doesn't have the same percentage, but there's a lot of great activists and a lot of great there, and also great journalists that are speaking up about it. The parallel is 30 years ago in LA, where prior to the LA riots, like, the Korean community was pushing for, hey, we need to have Korean speaking reporter in LA Times, because we're seeing this, like, anti sort of Korean anti-Asian rhetoric, and also, having us get pit against other folks. And you're seeing the result of that, like, as these attacks happened to Koreatown, like, the Asian story was basically, written off. And so you kind of have a underrepresented narrative about what we face, and it's downplayed. Oh, so what, or it didn't happen. After Atlanta last year, all these celebrities too started speaking up because of Stop Asian Hate movement. But then earlier this year, we have folks who told us, oh, we're glad Stop Asian Hate, was last year and it's over, right? And people started speaking up. But then right away, you had, very horrific attacks, right? Like, Michelle Go and Christina Lee and others who, died, right, this year, and others, right? And so this has continued really unabated. But I think people in leadership, there's enough problems to deal with, frankly, in America. They don't need, Asians also raising their issues, but we have to, because we can't change our, Asian identity. It's who we are. We live here, right? And we're not going to go anywhere. Like, this is our home. And so we have to go start fighting back. And so I think there is a shift in consciousness of really Asians starting to rise up and fight back for identity. And I think also they're seeing kind of neither party, Democrat, Republican, really put our issues at the forefront, kind of at the table as equals. So really have to push for our issues. And it's really not about, any particular party or particular ideology. It's like, hey, this is a complex problem, but we should be at the core seat to solve it together. Otherwise, it's going to just continue.
We should feel comfortable with saying, no, there's a double standard being applied here and it's being applied to us and that's not okay. And we need to demand accountability. Like, I think for us to even get to the point of wanting to speak out about it, we also have to really feel it's happening to us too.
Part of what we're doing with workplace reporting forum is, as you report, we give you many examples of what discrimination might look like, right? Things that could be pretty subtle, even saying things like, oh, we feel like you're not a team player or you're too cold, right? Or sort of emotional kind of behaviors. Same thing for hate crimes, right? Sort of like you can feel it perhaps instinctively, right? And the legal definition for hate crime is super high, just because it doesn't mean the existing legal definition, and perhaps it means the current laws are flawed, they're current unjust, needs to be changed. It doesn't mean it's not a hate crime directed against Asians, right? So I think, especially when you see the victim saying, "Hey, I believe I was targeted. It was, for being Asian," we need to support that person versus supporting, what the police chief or the district attorney says, right? Someone who most likely is not Asian, telling us what is and what is not a hate crime or what is not discrimination. So I think we need to, really push for it. I think that's what the protests, with the rallies in South Asian was saying, hey, no, this is a hate crime. These are hate crimes. Like, we need to be acknowledged. I think we need to continue that. But now at this point, focus on particular changes that needs to be done. And I think at this point, all the Asians are kind of aware, okay, the hate crimes are happening, right? But then what you're seeing over and over again, more attacks, victims, but where are the results? Where's the accountability? Where's the justice? Like, we need to really move towards getting justice at this point.
Your story is just very interesting, going from being a tech CEO to now being kind of this like full-fledged activist with SWAA and also what you're doing in the Bay Area. So, just love to hear about what are you working on right now, what's coming up and what you're working towards.
The number one thing we're trying to solve and figure out is, how do we create this stronger, connected Asian American community, both in being part of it and also being part of what it means to be an Asian American, and how do you get involved? And so we have a lot of folks who asked us, hey, I want to get involved with activism and I have, some certain time, maybe you have some windows of time, right? How do you get involved? And so, we're really thinking through, how do we build the community? And I think there are some major shifts that opens up possibility. A lot of professionals, you're able to work more remotely, or you have the choice to do so, right? So that you can focus more and move to places where, you may have more inclusion and there's more Asian Americans. And so we're thinking of really, how do we create this a deeper kind of membership and feeling that you are an Asian American, right? And then be able to discuss these issues. Over here, somebody discussed whether it's discrimination or Asian violence. And so it takes a village, right, to be able to fight, to get the right people into power, to fund the operations that and take us there. And we have a lot of potential Asian Americans and resources. Some of the tech companies and big companies were 30, 40, even 50% of the company, but it doesn't feel like it, right? Because you're not represented in positions of power. And so that has to change. And so we're really thinking through how we can bring all of these Asian American professionals together in a more sort of organized way, and also feeling you're part of this community and knowing that it is backed by something. And so that's something that we're working on. Hopefully I can tell you more in the future.
That sounds absolutely necessary. And hopefully we'll see that happen in our lifetime so that our kids don't have to go through the feeling of not feeling connected. What gives you hope? What keeps you fighting for this community?
It's just meeting people like yourself and people that I've never met before who really care about this issue. They're few in sort of the activist sort of community. It is going to be a small percentage of people who are taking on this risk and the burden. But I'm seeing people, continue to fight, and we are seeing results too. We're seeing changes happening in the media. We're seeing lawsuits being filed and decisions that are going in our favor. We are seeing a change happening in our country by fighting for Asian safety and discrimination. Is really fighting for myself and my family, and so it's really fighting for yourself. So I would never give up on myself and my family. And so I think really framing it that way, I think of all these victims, potential victims, as my, Grandpa Vicha as my grandpa. I would never give up on my family. And so even if it were really grim, I would still continue to fight, because it is really just, fighting for our people.
If we don't do it, who else will? I mean, how could we expect others to if we don't do it for ourselves, right? What's one call to action that you would want to say to the Asian American community?
If you're an Asian professional, get involved in your Asian ERG, or if you don't have one, form one. in your ERG, looking at, of course, in the early days, in the beginning, maybe looking at the culture stuff, but looking at discrimination and getting the data in your internal company to figure out, hey, is there a pattern of discrimination? Are we getting promoted at the same rates? Are there different groups? And really kind of starting to understand the issue. So I think that's really where a lot of the Asian ERGs are. And that as you continue to understand these issues, reach out to groups like Asian Leaders Alliance or Stand with Asian Americans to get connected to the bigger community. And so, I think the number one thing is we need to be organized, because otherwise we're just fighting skirmishes here and there. We're going against powerful corporations and governments, right, that have tanks, that have very powerful weapons. So we really need to be organized so that we are protected and that we are effective as we do fight discrimination and fight for our civil rights.
On the next episode of The Tiger in the Room, we talk to Monthanus Ratanapakdee and Eric Lawson, the daughter and son-in-law of the late Vicha Ratanapakdee and the founders of a nonprofit organization called Justice for Vicha. Vicha Ratanapakdee was an 84-year-old Thai American grandfather who was murdered in broad daylight outside of his home in San Francisco on January 28, 2021. His death sparked national outrage and brought mainstream attention to the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes that have been sweeping the country since the start of COVID-19. We talked to Monthanus and Eric about their efforts to preserve and honor their late father's memory while continuing to raise awareness about the ongoing problem of anti-Asian hate.